Awesome. So with that, I'm excited to get us started and get us moving into this session. As I said, our objectives here are to discuss the role of research partnerships or of partnerships in the research process, and then examine some of those nuances of partnerships in research. To get us started, I want to kind of do quick introductions here. For the first section, I'm going to be working with my two colleagues and friends here, Dr. Lorena Haber and Marika Warner. I'm going to turn it over to you two to do quick introductions of yourselves before we move it on there. So Lorena, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. I'm Lorena Haber from the University of Regina, and I'm joining today from Treaty 4 land.
Marika Warner. I work at MLSE Launchpad in Toronto, but I'm joining today from Treaty 1 land in Winnipeg with the Red River at my left side.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I do have all these other panelists here that we're going to be talking with as well. I'll flip it over to you and just give you the chance to introduce yourselves as well, if you don't mind. We'll go with the order that I've got here on the slide.
Hi, everyone. Tristan Hopper from the University of Regina, and also joining from Treaty 4 territory today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Corliss Bean, and I'm an assistant professor at Brock University in the Recreation and Leisure Studies Department. Really excited to be here today. Thanks for the invite, Kyle, and looking forward to chatting with everybody in the breakout sessions.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, Laura, I think, is not quite with us yet, but if you're there, Laura, feel free to jump on. If not, we'll pass it on to Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Lindsay Hayhurst today, joining you from Vancouver on University of British Columbia campus, but I am normally affiliated with York University. I'm just on sabbatical out here. So it's wonderful to be here. And thanks so much for organizing this and for having me.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Dubnwick. I'm in Treaty 4 lands in Regina, and I'm assistant professor at the University of Regina. Nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I also just want to take a second to recognize some of this other support that we've received for this event and for this series of events. So from Brock University, the University of Regina, MLSE Launchpad, who's been an awesome partner to work on this stuff with, and also from funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So thank you so much to all those people who have kind of supported and brought that along. For those of you who are joining us, if you've been a part of another one of these sessions, also thank you for coming back and joining. I'm glad to see you again, and I hope you're finding these useful. So with that, we can kind of roll into the process. So as I said in the first section here, we want to talk a little bit about the research process, understanding what that looks like, and then understanding the role that partnerships can play in the research process. So I'm going to kick us off the top here, and then I'm going to pass it over to Lorena and Marika. But the first thing I wanted to kind of put up here and discuss a little bit is what this research process is, or what the research process looks like. So for those of you who have been involved in research before, you know that research sometimes can be described as a messy process, or one that doesn't necessarily follow a linear trajectory. But generally, when we think about research, we think of it as this kind of systematic endeavor that we do that's planned and purposeful and intentional, and it follows these important kind of steps. So generally, you identify an issue, or you identify a gap in knowledge, or something that we don't know enough or as much about as we would like. And then you engage in this kind of systematic investigation of what we do know, and what are the gaps, and how could we kind of address these issues by creating some sort of knowledge that would better inform us in this. And then we generally design some sort of process whereby we're going to learn about it by collecting data, analyzing data, and then kind of engaging that data with the knowledge that we already know to help us kind of figure out what this new knowledge is. Now, this can take many different forms, and it can look many different ways. And I think what's important to recognize here is that partnerships can be engaged or embedded at various stages of this research process. So there are forms of research that we engage in where we try to embed partnerships in the entire research process, right, where we conduct them, where we're working with different stakeholders at different stages of the process and really kind of embed that idea of partnership throughout. But then there are also types of research where you might only partner on some of these phases of the research process. So by understanding problems, right, to understand real world problems, we might work with partners to help kind of map out what some of those look like. On the other end of this cycle, we might work with partners to help circulate results or engage results and discuss those findings with different groups to kind of test them out and see what they might look like to inform practice at the end of a research process. So there's many kind of different ways that we can think about partnership in this kind of broader research context. One of the kind of important things that underlies a lot of research processes is this idea of, we've got the idea of objectivity here. So not to suggest that we're always objective and we're always completely removed, but I think it's important to recognize that often when we engage in these research processes, we're not setting out to prove something that we want to see happen, right? We're not thinking about, we already know what we want to say and we're trying to write a process that will help us justify what we think or what we want. Rather, we're engaging in this to build or create knowledge or construct knowledge in some way by working with this data. So I think that's an important kind of idea that underpins many of these research processes, is that we seek out in these kind of systematic processes to develop knowledge about something, but we generally don't know what we're going to find, right? We don't know in advance what we're trying to prove. We're testing out these ideas and trying to determine how we can systematically see what that looks like. So this is kind of our broad kind of overview of the research process. And as I said, we can think about the different ways that partners can be engaged or involved in different steps of the process. And that's much of what we're going to do as we kind of move through these sessions today and work through the next few sessions that we have planned. So with that, I'm going to flip it over to Lorena, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of these key ideas and things that we want to think about when we're thinking or talking about research partnerships.
Great, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think, and we're going to start off sort of in a logical process about where do we start and what's the purpose and goals of doing these research, doing this type of research. So I'm going to speak a little bit at the beginning here about why do we engage in research, and speak from a little bit of both, but I'll ask Marika if she has something else, Marika, if you've got something else to add to this part. But typically for academics, why do we engage in research? Part of it, comes from curiosity. We have a curiosity about things that are around us. And it's also to contribute to literature. We want to create that knowledge that helps to extend our understanding of different types of concepts or ideas that exist. But why do we actually engage in partnership types of research or working with communities? I think we're starting to realize now about a lot of what we've done has existed in an ivory tower. It stays here within any university. And we need to go beyond that to engage in research that perhaps is more authentic, more real world, actually making a difference and having that impact that Kyle talked about before. So on the other way around, in terms of community partners, and again, I'm speaking on their behalf as I'm not one of them, but a lot of times research is based on this idea of solving a problem or a real world issue that they may have. So why would they engage in partnerships and coming to the university? That could be because of capacity. It could be because of there's an assumption of expertise. And I say assumption of expertise because it's important to recognize that that expertise goes both ways. It's not, we're not the holders of expertise. So part of that knowledge and that capacity that we may have. So what do we hope to get out of this research? Again, I'll say from an academic perspective, some of that is, it's that knowledge building. It's that it scratches that itch, or that curiosity that we have. But again, from a practical perspective, it's about getting grants. It is doing research. It's getting publications. But again, I think some of the academics are moving away from that. Again, from a partner's perspective, again, it's that idea of maybe having a richer understanding or an explanation for what's going on. Marika, did you want to add anything else to this part before we move on to the next part?
Sure, thanks. I'll jump in very quickly here. I'd say
Yeah.
similarly, we're generally, when we're entering a research partnership, looking to answer a question that's burning in our minds. We're looking to validate or sometimes challenge a belief that we have about how things are impacting the youth that we work with. And also we're looking, as you mentioned, to augment or build some capacity or expertise around a certain approach, maybe that we don't have within our team. Nutrition would be one example. We're a sport for development organization. We may partner with a nutrition researcher to bring that expertise to our team, or a researcher who's also in sport for development but has a specific expertise that we would lack within our team, for like around participatory action research is one example.
Great. Yeah, we can move on to the next one. So some of the, and a really important part about entering these partnerships is having some discussions about expectations, because as much as there's sort of a mutual sense of we can work together, we can bring strengths to these partnerships, sometimes those expectations are different though. And that's really important to have that and discuss that prior to starting, because it can get really awkward and uncomfortable if this happens later on, or if they're not discussed. So some of that is understanding what are the investments, what are we putting into this research partnership? And again, obviously part of that is time, but is it money? So for example, as academics, we're often looking for funding to support students, graduate students, undergraduate students, to support doing the research. For a partner, is it investments in terms of we're getting access to space, we're getting access to those locations, those experiences, but we have to have that discussion before that. Timelines are incredibly important as well too. I was just working with a graduate student the other day and having her understand that the timelines in academia are much slower, usually much slower than what we might actually see in a community partner. And that can come from many different reasons. Some of it is we have to go through research ethics, and research ethics can take months before we're even allowed to actually start doing some of those things. And so some of those things have to be discussed and shared beforehand so that partners, again, understand if a community partner wants something done in 6 months, that might not be feasible at all in working with an institution or with academic partners. So what are those timelines and what's realistic for both of those partners and moving forward? It's also important to talk about some of those contingencies or backup plans. Again, what if some of the partners move away, or someone retires, or we don't have grad students anymore to do something? Or in my case, I did work with MLSE Launchpad and COVID happened and we were doing a place-based study, and I'm in Regina. I cannot be in Toronto. How do we actually do this? So we just put it on hold for quite a long time, actually, to do that. And that was okay. But having that open discussion was really important to understand that it wasn't going to impact me in terms of my career, and we were going to do it whenever it was safe to do it for MLSE Launchpad, but we have to have some of those types of discussions moving forward. Outputs are also important to discuss. Like, what is it that we want to get out in the end? Again, for academics, our currency is publications and presentations. That is the currency. It is changing in the sense that we are also considering other things, other types of knowledge translation that might happen, infographics or podcasts or videos. But the real currency for us right now still is those things. We need that as part of the legitimacy of what we do. For partners, it may be something very different. Again, it could be these other creative types of knowledge translation that are more, have better reach, have better impact, speak to different audiences, or again, it may be just simply solving a problem or an issue, and then that's done and we can move on in that sense. So those are some of the things that need to be discussed. And again, Marika, I'll invite you to add some of your insight into this as well.
Thanks. Yes, I'll add some nuance from the community or industry perspective. So I'd say clarifying expectations with the research partner is going to need to happen at some point along the way. So it can happen up front, or it can happen as you go, but laying things out on the table up front can really help avoid running into the extra meetings, extra stress, potential conflicts as the project progresses. So in establishing expectations, it can actually be hard to know what needs to be covered off comprehensively. After all, you don't know what you don't know, and you're entering into this partnership newly. So it can be easy for the community or industry partner to assume that an academic partner understands community-based research processes in the same way that we do, or vice versa. But I've learned in about 7 years now of executing community-based research partnerships in sport for development and in the professional sport corporate social responsibility space, that it's best not to assume that your partner gets it. This also doesn't mean, assume that your partner doesn't get it, with it being your methods, your needs, or your values. I can tell you it's also pretty irritating when an academic partner explains a term like control group or longitudinal to me as if I'm not also an established researcher with several letters after my name and publications, etc., simply because I don't answer to professor. But in the same vein, I would avoid assuming that an academic partner's approach is going to be extractive, is going to be deficit-based or disempowering for community members. But I also don't assume that it's going to be deeply collaborative, strengths-based, youth-led, all the things that we like to prioritize. So I ask questions, listen, learn, explain, and look for partners that also do those things. So that can feel like over-communicating in the early stages of a project, and I would urge you, over-communicate. So when I haven't, I've really lived to regret it. My team tends to have about 4 preliminary meetings with a research partnership before we would commit to even a relatively low stakes partnership. And that doesn't feel excessive. So, think of it as a dating analogy. If you like spending time with the person and getting to know them, it's a pleasure. It's a high point of your week. It's not just a necessary precursor to getting into the relationship. So expectations I make sure to clarify during that dating period would include, how is the project going to be funded? Who's going to be responsible for quarterbacking the grant applications, how the grants will flow, who gets the dollars to then share out, who's going to hire and supervise any research assistants or other project support people, and can we agree on important qualifications or qualities within those project staff that we're going to hire, who will complete ethics application and with which body. There are community-based ethics approval bodies as well that we work through, so it's important to clarify that, especially with the timeline issue that Lorena mentioned. If there's going to be a project advisory board or committee, what will their role be as an advisory, more as a consultancy? Do they have a decision-making influence? Very detailed timeline, and also the degree of flexibility in the timeline that's been established. How data from the project will be shared and stewarded, who will ultimately own the data, desired knowledge mobilization outputs, of course, and also publication plans, reserving our right as community partners to be aware of, to have an option to co-author if appropriate, and also to review and approve any articles that are submitted for publication. And then how our insight to action model at MLSE Launchpad typically works, in that the project isn't over until all of the relevant stakeholders have been fully debriefed and really empowered to action the learnings. Even if the paper has been submitted, it's not over until we have those next steps in motion.
So I think here again as well too, and I think Marika actually just talked about a lot of these things, but it is so important to understand and really evaluate that fit of the partnership, because it is a partnership. It is not just a co-worker or something that you're going to tolerate, but you do have to work together with this. And it is something you have to have those assessments, and how do you communicate together? Do you have any red flags? Like, does something come up where you're speaking a very different language? Things aren't really working very well, and that might just be you have to work through some of those tensions or those uncomfortableness beforehand. But again, if you feel like you have very different philosophies on what's happening, very different ideas about timelines, not really a respectful type of partnership happening between those are all those cues just to be very careful about and moving forward with this. And again, some of those things are also being able to adapt if necessary. And again, that has to happen. We have to be aware of that things can change. For example, with a community partner, people can leave, they can move to a different organization. Again, same thing with an academic, that maybe they're on sabbatical, or they might move as well too. That those are just some of those realities that you have to have that flexibility in moving forward. But communication is so important as part of this, to be able to ride those waves. And again, Marika, if you've got something else you want to add to this part about the fit of partnerships.
Yeah, really echo what you said. You want to partner with people you like, people you want to work with, as well as people that you share research passions with. People that you enjoy spending time with are going to make great research partners. And then the fit of the project is also key. So some questions my team would ask ourselves when approached with a proposal to partner on a new research project would be, one, does our team have capacity to take on a new academic partner? Two, is the project connected to something that we're already doing? If not, taking it on is probably going to create a mission drift or misalignment with our strategic direction. Third, does the research appear to align with our theory of change? And our theory of change articulates why, how we believe that the programs and services that we offer lead to our desired impact. So is our theory supported by the theories that are implicit in the proposed research? Fourth, does the research contribute to a gap in knowledge at Launchpad or in our larger sector? Will it help to solve problems on the ground? Will the research provide us with meaningful information about the youth, the families, and the communities that we serve? And finally, are there any concerns around the researcher, the resources that we're going to require to execute the project, the proposed timeline? So those are some other aspects of fit to think about in making that call on whether to continue with a partnership.
Oh, you're muted. Oh no, we lost Kyle. Oh no,
Sorry about
he's coming
that.
back.
No. I was muted there. I was just saying I really like that metaphor of thinking of it as a dating relationship, and I've heard people use that before as well. You know, like a partnership or relationships with research partners. They're not something that you show up and say like, I want one. How do I get one? Right? You don't say I want a husband. Someone tell me how to get a husband. It's a thing you work at. It's a relationship that you feel out, and then you have to find the right people. And we don't think of our personal relationships in that way, so we shouldn't think of our research relationships in that way either. So I really thank you for that metaphor, Marika. So to kind of summarize these and bring these together, we talked about a lot of these kind of big ideas, but we wanted to provide you with a couple examples, I guess, so you could see both kind of the breadth of partnership work and what it can look like in the context of research. So to kind of summarize these things and bring them together, we thought it's helpful to think about a partnership in terms of the inputs, so what goes into it, the throughputs, or what's going to happen throughout the process, and then also some of the outputs. So what are the things that are going to come out of it for the different partners who are involved. And so we've got those kind of looped around there, recognizing that there are different types of outputs that can come from these things. And while we can all work on them and they can be mutually beneficial for everyone, sometimes we just have to think about the kind of directions of those outputs and what we're looking to, where we're looking for them to be targeted at. So what I think we're going to do is go through, and then each of us, the three of us, are just going to provide you with an example from one of our own partnerships and kind of categorize it in this way to give you a sense of the breadth of what these can look like. So I'll kick it off because I have one that I think was an interesting one to consider. A few years ago, worked with the folks at Row Ontario. So the CERC had this researcher partnership initiative where they were trying to bring people together with sport organizations. And we were interested in looking at the kind of geographic distribution of sport participation. So what sport participation looks like spatially, how people are spread out. And so we got connected with the folks at Row Ontario to do this kind of geospatial analysis of their sport participation. So I think this was interesting because it was a pretty low stakes kind of partnership in terms of inputs. Row Ontario had registration data over a period of 6 years that was complete enough that we could do this kind of analysis. And we had the skills that we could train up an RA who did a bunch of really interesting analysis and plotted the participants on a map. And we were able to do a bunch of kind of measuring that way. So in terms of our inputs, we had a little bit of funding to kind of pay an RA, and we had participation data, which was the key thing that as researchers sometimes can be really difficult to access. So the inputs were quite kind of low stakes in that regard because Row Ontario had the data, we had the skills, and we were just kind of working together with the things we already had. Throughputs in terms of the research process, this was just a lot of kind of geospatial analysis. So we were running different kinds of analyses, doing up different kinds of visualizations. It was a lot of just conversations about what works, what's useful, what's helpful, what isn't. We ended up with way more maps than we could ever use or need. It was something like 104 maps. A total of probably 10 of them were like super useful for us. But learning through the process of creating them and discussing them and going back and forth was a key kind of input that we were both participating in. And then at the end of it, we had designed outputs so that we'd have them for both kind of the academic audience as well as for the organization. So we had an academic article that was really about piloting this method, so trying this different method of analyzing sport participation data. And then we also did up kind of a more formal report for the organization. So I believe Tammy's got those links there that she can share in the chat so people can see what those two looked like. So the first one that just came in there, that's the academic paper. It doesn't include all of the maps and all of the things. And then the second one that'll come in is the link to the report that we did up for Row Ontario. And they talked about, how this was an interesting way to look at data and think about the resources and the challenges that were already existing in their system. So there was some really interesting things that came out of it, just about the kind of age differences even in rowers. When you look at the Ontario as a whole, you look like you have an average age of 25, 26. But when you look regionally, some regions have an average age of like 34, 35, and others have an average age of 19. So there's very different kind of populations in this way. And we had some really interesting discussions about kind of programs and policies that could come from this kind of analysis more broadly for the organization. So that was my quick one as an example of kind of an interesting one that came together. That was a really productive one. You've got those examples there if people can check them out. And I'm happy to discuss it later if people wanted to chat more about that. But that's it for my example. I'll pass it over to Lorena now if you want to talk a bit about one.
Sure. I'll just talk really briefly about the one that I did with MLSE Launchpad. And again, this was a pretty low risk. I don't know if it's low risk, but it was not a major substantial type of project. But again, what was interesting about this one was Marika came to me. She asked me if I would be interested in doing this project, which I was very grateful for. And again, it's interesting, me being in Regina, I have no connection out there, but a recommendation from another researcher that I might be interested in have the knowledge about understanding organizational culture or place, which was something that they were looking for. So in terms of inputs, it was actually very, very small in terms of inputs from the different groups. So what MLSE Launchpad could offer obviously was the place and the access to participants, that sort of permission and the accessibility into it. We really had very little funding. We had no funding for this. This was self-funded type of project. They also had access to a research assistant who they've used before. So that was a very great opportunity to have someone that was on the ground that they could and already had connection to the participants. So for me, I brought some knowledge and some skill set in terms of doing this type of a research design. So the inputs was really small. Again, the throughputs, a lot of that was just working in combination and connection with them, doing it from afar and having that trust, I think, from both parties that we could do this from afar and I could coordinate some of those things from afar and have it happen with MLSE's support and some of their capacity to allow that to happen. In terms of the outputs, I'll say I'm a little behind on this one. I'm going to out myself of that I still have a report to do and I still have a paper to do as part of this. But again, that's part of a reality of working together, that things can slow down a little bit. We have done an infographic, a couple presentations, but one of the great things that MLSE Launchpad has is some creative skills of some of their staff. So I think there's some work being done to create a video to showcase this, and then that is not something that I have any skill set or any knowledge about. So relying on some of the excellent skills that they have amongst their staff to create knowledge translation outputs that I would not be able to do, which is actually very exciting for me. So I'll pass it off now.
Thanks, Lorena. And so many partnerships I could speak to, but I decided for today to highlight MLSE Foundation's annual Change the Game research project as an example. That's an annual project, is now entering its third year. We partner on this with University of Toronto with Dr. Simon Darnell primarily. And the first iteration to talk to the inputs was funded entirely internally by our MLSE Launchpad, MLSE Foundation research budget. So this meant we had to keep expenses low. The academic support was fairly light and it was provided in kind. In the second year, we secured a corporate partnership to support the project. So that allowed for several new project elements and elevated the project significantly. And with the partner, we discussed at length the pros, cons, and guidelines of working with a corporate partner. We were fortunate that this knowledge mobilization partner didn't require any logo or name recognition in relationship to the study, which made things a bit easier. In the third year, we've now worked to secure a grant from the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada, and that grant was written and submitted collaboratively by a team involving myself, a manager on my team, the academic partner, and the grant administrator in his department to really spread out that work. I won't go too deep into the throughputs. They've evolved over the years. It's largely based in a mixed methods census style survey. We have some additional qualitative components coming on board this year. We use an advisory committee to distribute the work of academic advisors so that no one's really saddled with a heavy load and we can access some really specific expertise. Academic outputs now have included an absolutely fire paper in sociology of sport, and I'll drop some links in the chat after I stop talking. We have some community sector and industry facing outputs, which have been incredibly valuable for us. So those have included a report, a public dashboard, and anonymized data set that's available online, and several events. The dashboard, which I'll share, was a really essential component of this project as the project was designed around data utility. So we needed for sport practitioners across Ontario to be able to access this really rich data that we gathered in connection to their specific use case. So for example, we needed to ensure that someone working as an administrator in an after-school sport program in Sudbury, wanting to start a girls program, could access data that would help them to understand the needs and desires of that intersectional youth population that they were serving or hoping to serve in their own geographical and cultural context. So we had a large-scale report launch event as well that was attended by a ton of youth, coaches, industry allies, corporate MLSE partners, and received a lot of media coverage, earned media coverage, which was great. We had a virtual community learning series event as well, connected to the different sport for development organizations in MLSE Foundation's network to help use those project learnings to inform their own programming and decision making. And those findings from this project have fed into consultations on the 2023 Canadian Sport Policy, Carnegie Initiative for Racial Inclusion in Hockey, our own granting decisions, and our own new Justin Bieber sponsored ball hockey initiative, just to name a few places where this knowledge has showed up, has had some feet. In May, we'll be hosting a group of representatives from several different provincial sport organizations and other sport convening bodies to workshop actions that they've taken to change the game in their context, how they can collaborate with us to keep moving towards a more positive and inclusive youth sport system that's based on what youth are telling us they need to see in the sport system. So that project is a really great example of how widely the impact of a partnership in research can ripple. And in the context of industry, how quickly those ripples can actually reverberate. So really closing that unacceptable gap that we see between the generation and the implementation of knowledge in the sports sector.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Those are three great examples of I like how we all kind of had talked about the resources and the things that are enabled through partnership, right? So the different things that people bring to the table and are able to engage in that way. There's some good chat happening in the chat there, so I'd encourage people, feel free to throw in your questions like that. I did have one question related to mine there that was related to the budget. So how much was the budget for that project? I believe those CERC grants that we accessed were $2,500. And so it was quite a small grant. And for the most part, we just paid the RA. She did a whole bunch of amazing work. She already knew her GIS programs really well, and she was able to really help us learn some of that stuff as well. And so yeah, it was quite small. We talked about a few different like a few of us have mentioned different granting agencies or organizations like that. Another one that's really helpful and good for partnership work is MyTax. MyTax is a granting program, so for applied industry style type research, if partners can put up up so much funds to have a researcher work on their programs or in the research with them, my tax matches it, and it's actually a not competitive program, which is a nice one. You work with someone at your university to apply, and as long as it qualifies, then it generally moves forward. So it doesn't have that big, that you need to apply by a deadline and wait and see, and then maybe not get it. It's kind of a rolling intake one, and it's really helpful to facilitate these kind of partnership work as well as some of the ones that we kind of mentioned there. Thank you also for sharing those examples in the chat. Those are good. Hopefully people have a chance to check those out. And we're certainly happy to share all those kind of resources, compile them and put them together if people would like them afterwards as well. So with that, we're ready, I think, to move into the next kind of section of our talk here. I will give just a second to breathe here if people want to put a question in the chat or ask anything there before we flip into talking to our panelists. I'll just give us a chance to do that there, so I'm not rushing too quickly. Okay, great. No questions. Looks like we're doing okay. Awesome. So with that, I'm going to move into the second half where, as I said, we're going to break out and have some of those discussions about those nuances of partnership. So some of the more kind of nitty-gritty elements of it. There are many kind of moving parts and elements to a research partnership. And so we've assembled this awesome group of people that I'm really excited to introduce you to. They've all got different kinds of expertise, and we're going to be able to pick their brains and have some discussions with them. So just for context for everyone, how the next session is going to work, we're going to have 2 sessions. So it'll be 2 breakout sessions. One will go the first 20 minutes. You'll get to pick one session that you want to be in. The second will go for 20 minutes again, and you'll get to pick another session that you want to be in. And so we've got our partners broken up here. I'm going to start by giving them a chance to introduce themselves to you, so you get a bit of a teaser for what it's going to look like. Then I'll show you the schedule, and you'll be able to opt into the rooms that you want to join. So I will start with our introductions, and then we'll move forward onto that. So I'm going to start by asking a few questions here. I'm going to call on Dr. Tristan Hopper from the University of Regina. You are my first on my list here. So your research has considered some different approaches to working with communities. So I'm wondering if, as your teaser question for the group, if you could explain a little bit the difference between doing research on communities or organizations and doing research with them.
Great question, Kyle. Thanks so much for it. And some of the things that I'm going to share with you in response to your question, you've talked a little bit about in some of your introductory remarks, but typically research that focuses on communities might view participants, organizations, community members as passive subjects for which data can be extracted and used for the advancement of knowledge sort of on their behalfs. And I think at the same time, it asks us to consider at what point does community-based research become community-based. You know, all different types of research can take place within community and community groups, but what does that with really look like is quite key, I think, as we start to think about creating partnerships with community. And so on the contrary, then research that is with community would view participants, organizations, community as valued knowledge holders, experts, and would actively engage them to co-produce the research. And so this is particularly important when we start thinking about working alongside equity deserving or equity seeking communities who have been researched or are hesitant of the process. And so as opposed to sort of a top-down approach, when we think about research on communities, the with is more of a bottom-up approach where we might sort of invite community members and participants to be involved in some, all, or portions of those steps that you outlined in that your cyclical research process image earlier on in your slide deck.
Awesome. So what can people, if they join your breakout group, what kind of topics can they expect to chat with you about?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to start off by just sharing some takeaways or learnings from a recent project with youth experiencing homelessness. And then in that, I'll sort of share some of our partnerships, sort of key learnings or takeaways from that particular project. And then I'll open it up for some discussions and things to chat about when we start thinking about working alongside vulnerable communities.
Awesome, great. And one more question for you. What is a highlight from one of your research partnerships that you might want to share with the group?
Yeah, I struggled with this one because there are lots of highlights that I can think of, but for me, it's always the opportunity to be welcomed into a community, perhaps as an outsider, and to build relationships, meaningful relationships with the communities and the individuals that I'm working alongside.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So that was your teaser there. Next, I'm going to flip to Dr. Corliss Bean, who is my colleague here at Brock University. She is our evaluation guru. So her discussion is going to talk a bit about evaluation. Corliss, I'm wondering if you can explain to people briefly how research and evaluation are different.
Yeah, great question. I try and keep it nice and simple in terms of that explanation. And I often say to students when I'm teaching my evaluation courses is that research seeks to prove and evaluation seeks to improve. And I think you alluded to that notion of proving earlier on in the talk. And when we think about kind of our overall definition of what actually is evaluation, it's a systematic approach to asking and answering questions about a program, an initiative, an event, whatever that may be, and making decisions based on those kind of identified questions and supporting evidence. And to me, that sounds a lot like research. So how do we kind of differentiate them? So there's similar designs, there's similar methods that can be used, but we often think research aims to be more generalizable and kind of contribute to that broader academic literature, whereas evaluation is very specific. And as I kind of walk through it, it's specific to a particular program, a particular context, a particular time frame, and that specificity is really the main difference between research and evaluation. So when we think about, as an example, kind of how a program was run at Launchpad during the pandemic, they had to pivot from in-person programming to virtual programming. And by doing an evaluation to figure out, hey, you know what are our best practices? What's going well in our virtual programming? How did we have to tweak? And what do we need to continue to improve to meet those needs is kind of one way that we would benefit from evaluating and learning and improving upon. And those findings and those questions might be very different from the exact same program to being virtual to being in person. However, such information that they're learning about during these evaluations can contribute to research in kind of the broader field on, say, for example, conducting virtual sport programs or something like that. So they are similar and complementary processes, and what we started to hear already from you guys as panelists, I think it's really important to recognize that this is one way to allow for that community engaged process, and supporting evaluation is often something that's really identified as a barrier in community organizations in terms of time, resources, training, those sorts of things. So hopefully, because they're so similar, researchers can support in those evaluation practices.
Awesome. And so, yeah, briefly, what can they expect to learn in your discussion group?
Yeah, really get the most meaningful experiences for you guys. I always have lots of case examples, some things to share my case examples. But I think one of the biggest things that I hope to share with people is that I constantly hear from our community partners that evaluation is a scary word and that they try and normalize it, or they don't even use the word in the culture. So it's something they have to do for reporting purposes and not something necessarily that they want to do. Hopefully by engaging in this community engaged research or partnership, because it's mutually beneficial, we can then, how as researchers or students, we can support community organizations in terms of learning about undertaking and valuing evaluation and what your role can kind of be in that process.
Awesome. And what is one highlight from a research partnership that you would like to share?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. Similar, I think I have a lot of highlights. I love the work that I do with community organizations, but I think for me, one highlight is seeing when organizations truly understand, value, and adopt evaluation as part of their regular practice. And it's not just an add-on or a box they need to check for reporting purposes, that they're truly building a culture around evaluation. So again, Launchpad is an excellent example of that, but there's other organizations that I've worked with, like Boys and Girls Club of Ottawa. I've worked with them for over a decade, and kind of seeing that process evolve over a decade has been, yeah, transformational. So it gives me warm and fuzzies in my nerdy evaluation sort of way.
Awesome. The evaluation warm and fuzzies, love it. Awesome. So next I'll flip to Dr. Lindsay Hayhurst from York University. Dr. Hayhurst, you have done lots of work that's been formalized through different kinds of mechanisms, I guess. So I'm wondering if you can just share with us, what are some of the ways that research partnerships can be formalized?
Sure. Thanks, Kyle. And I'm also getting warm and fuzzies here, Corliss. Just this discussion is really right up my alley, and I hope more of these opportunities happen for us to all connect. Yeah, I think right now I'm lucky enough to be working with Launchpad as well on a project with Francine Derrick, and also I'm working with 3 very different NGOs, non-governmental organizations, doing sport and mobility for development focused work globally. And so in thinking about this question about research partnerships and how they're formalized, I think it's just really important to have flexibility and adaptability in recognizing that partnerships evolve over time, and really involving community partners in the process of creating agreements so that you can directly address, for example, unequal power dynamics, systemic inequalities that might exist within research partnerships, documenting to the extent that you can what like where folks are coming from, and thinking a lot about how you can build relationships with community partners that's based on trust, respect, mutual understanding, and diverse principles that really encompass what folks are going to get at the end of the day. And so I have used MOUs, or memorandums of understanding, and that's a very Western approach, I'll say, to creating and formalizing partnerships. So I will say that although that's what it's officially called, in each context where I work, it really depends on how that partner wants to recognize and kind of substantiate the relationship that we have, and whether that's through a document or other forms. I really try to pay attention to something that's mutually beneficial and really focuses on addressing unequal power relations, to hone in on collectivity and how we can arrive at the end of the partnership. Many live on, and I've been in many for, I guess, a decade now, with goals that are meaningful and helpful for all parties involved.
Awesome. And so what are some of the things that people can expect to discuss in the breakout room with you? Yeah, so right now, I'm really heavily focused right now on digital, visual, and GIS participatory mapping approaches to working with community-based partners in a range of contexts. And so I think I was kindly given the topic of focusing on partnership agreements. And so in my breakout room, I think we're going to focus a lot on how you arrive to these agreements by co-creating research questions, by providing capacity support that's built into these agreements, and how these agreements can actually arrive at change maybe at the institutional level. So it starts with perhaps a document from both parties, but if you're using multiple like participatory action research methods and strategies, how do you ensure that those, I guess, objectives are built into a living agreement, a document, an agreement of some kind that can actually impact the change that all stakeholders are looking for? Awesome. And same question I've asked before, what's one highlight from a partnership that you might like to share?
Sure. Well, again, I'm really focused on digital participatory research right now, which is a fancy way of saying we're using, a lot of visual mediums, I guess, to work with community partners. One organization, a Sport for Development group we work in with Nicaragua, we have developed a number of digital stories and participatory maps that have fundamentally changed and shifted the ways that they, receive resources from funders and perceptions from community members around safe spaces. So in short, what I really take away from that is just that the substantive impact. So I guess a highlight for me is just knowing that some form of knowledge mobilization has created real kind of structural change, or at least contributed to that change. So that's always a highlight for me in working with organizations.
Awesome, thank you. Next we'll go to Dr. Michael Dubnowick from the University of Regina. And so you're going to talk a little bit about ethics. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about how you've experienced different ideas related to ethics in the context of research partnerships.
Echo, thanks for the question. Hello, everyone. I find this one oddly interesting. I teach an ethics course, so I'll kind of start from that point of I find it fun because I get to teach it, but it also was one of those things that I always thought about in research. And when I teach an ethics course, we often talk about like there's all these different frameworks that we can frame something in a different ethical fashion, where we come from like different bases. And one of the interesting things I've always found as a researcher, the way in which we frame ethics is extremely procedural, or from this place of, it comes from a good place of like, we have to predetermine things before we even start. And we go through like a research ethics process that we'd often talk about as very procedural, like what are the questions I'm going to ask? How many times am I going to sit down with someone? Here's the timeline. Here's all these things. How do I know that someone has the information so that they can consent fully and that I'll do no harm in the process? And those are like, I think the beautiful, beautiful things of that process when we say procedurally, that I've already thought about some of those things. And then there's the weird part of it that I experience as a researcher, that's like our academic world where we begin with REBs. And sometimes it gives us this weird little false sense of security that, okay, I've done all these processes, I've thought about all these things, and now I have this huge false sense of security that I'm going to do the ethical and right thing for the whole time, and I've already done it. And I've got this rubber stamp to prove it. And then when we write up papers or we do anything, it's like from this point of, someone told me I already did ethical. And then we don't continuously reflect on that process as we work with communities. And so it puts us in a big tenuous spot of sometimes I think we assume we're doing right. And we assume we work well together because we've had all the processes and we said, well, I followed A, B, C, D that I said I was going to do. And then this is where I hit like a different world when I go outside academia and we don't start with REBs and we go into communities and we're alongside. It's almost like a different question. And I've worked with a couple community-based organizations, largely in areas that have been marginalized, and work with like Indigenous youth and homeless populations. And one of the first things I've ever found, the ethical question isn't like, tell me your procedure. They do want to know that, and it has to be clear, but it often comes from that base, like, are you willing and able to build a relationship here that's actually meaningful and committed? And what does that look like to you? Which is a very, very different question and a very different responsibility. And so I'll talk about that when I'm going to the groups, and sometimes that weird disjuncture we have between like how we talk about it at universities, but when we hit communities, it's a whole different question.
Awesome, thank you. And can you share with us one highlight from a research partnership?
Highlight the warm and fuzzies. Oh, live in those. I'll try and say, I think one of the biggest highlights can be from the point, like sometimes we come with research puzzles or thoughts that we begin with, but when they do align with communities, and there's like some sense of coherency of saying like the values that we had and all these wonders we have, and we have all this beginning points, but when we hit a community and we sit down with people and it's the same, or we can actually listen to those living puzzles and say, we can align. it makes things really fun. And one of the ways that we're doing that currently with a program with Indigenous youth is the research was based in this place of like saying, like, can we create spaces to tell counter stories of the community that they live in? And a lot of the youth always were like trying to push against the stereotypes that were told of them. And so one of the beautiful things that we're doing is creating zines or zines. I don't say it right always, so I say both. But they're drawings, they're like comics. And it creates a different space to say, like, let's tell a counter stories through a method that works with the community.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so finally, unfortunately, Dr. Laura Meisner is not able to join us today. She sends her big apologies, but fortunately we had someone who was going to be in the discussion with Dr. Meisner. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kylie Wasser, who is going to join with us anyhow. And so Kylie, while working with Laura, she was one of the real kind of partnership brokers for some community organizations within the parasport space in Ontario. So Kylie's going to be talking to us a bit about policy and how policy change can be impacted through research. So Kylie, I'm wondering if you can give us an example of how you've seen policy change happen through research partnerships.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. In a word, slowly, but truly what we've seen, I'm going to be speaking specifically about the work that I did with Dr. Meisner for the Ontario Parasport Collective, which was a huge overarching project across the province that was dedicated to enhancing access and engagement in quality sport and physical activity opportunities for persons with a disability. Now, I said slowly, but again, particularly in the provincial context of Ontario, where we do have a provincial government that's been, committed to cutting funding across educational and recreational opportunities, particularly for marginalized groups. So I've seen, and we've seen the research that we've done impacting policy changes at multiple levels. I think up front, when we see policy change, we think federal big, but realistically, we did see some big, policy efforts and changes, but we've also seen a lot of structural and systemic changes happening at the local, provincial, and even some of the organizational connected pieces within our sports system. So I'm more than happy to talk about some of the realities of brokering some of these relationships, as within the Ontario Parasport Collective, we had over 35 partners, 70 individuals across funders, facilities, community organizations, researchers, municipalities, provinces, national and local sport organizations. And this was across education, sport, in and through sport pathways, events, disability and accessibility organizations. So pretty much a very broad encompassing of different types of partnerships. And those were all approached, brokered, negotiated, evaluated in a variety of ways. So what individuals, I'll steal your question, what individuals can look forward to in my discussion room is really the realities, challenges, and opportunities in brokering these types of relationships for these types of projects.
Awesome, thank you. And the same question I asked to others, do you have a highlight from a research partnership you'd like to share?
Do I ever? And I'm going to put a link to it in the chat because I have been waiting for this question. One of the greatest highlights in working with and for the OPC, because not only did I work on the research end, I actually ended up taking over as the director for the Parasport Collective for several years after the completion of my PhD. We partnered with the Coaches Association of Ontario, and they have a module for coaching athletes with a disability. And we were able to provide funding so that this module is now free for all Ontarians. So I encourage anyone and everyone to click that link to be able to have that certification and that module to have some better education, experience, understanding of working with athletes with a disability.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for these quick insights, giving people a sense of what your discussion rooms are going to look like. Without kind of further delay, I think I'm going to flip us into these breakout rooms. So just again, to give people an overview of what it will look like, we'll go out here into the first session. So that's session A. We'll have 3 room options here. So we'll have room 1 will be Tristan, room 2 will be Lindsay, and room 3 will be Michael. We'll have that open discussion for about 15 minutes. Then what we'll do is bring everyone back here to the main room when we will switch into session B, where we will have Corliss and Kylie. So you only at this point need to choose from session A. So choose which of those rooms you would like to go to. I believe with that, Jackie's going to open up the rooms and you will be able to opt into the room you want to go in. So you'll be able to just select the one you want to go to, jump into that, and you can jump right into that discussion group. So as I said, room 1 will be Tristan, room 2 will be Lindsay, and room 3 will be Michael. And everyone else, you're free to jump into that discussion with the one that you'd like. We're at 1:40 Eastern time now, so we'll probably cut this one off at about 1:55, and then we'll come back in and jump right into that second one, committed to making sure we're done on time. So we will, if we can open those up now, that would be great. And you should be able to jump into them very shortly. All right, everybody coming back in here. Welcome back. Heard there was some great discussion.
Thank you, Kylie.
Thank you so much for your question, Kelsey. Sorry we got cut off. More than happy to reach out to anyone after if you have any questions.
I did the same thing to Tristan too, so don't worry.
Awesome.
Awesome. I think we have everyone back here. So I just want to start by saying thank you all so much. We were popping in and out and it sounded like there was some really awesome discussion in all of those rooms. Just by way of, I guess, a little bit of a wrap up here as we come to the end, I think I'm just going to flip it to each of the facilitators and just ask them to give us just their very high level reflection on what we talked about or what was a highlight of their discussion. Don't need to give us the full on summary, but if there's one thing that stood out or something interesting nugget that you wanted to share with us, you can just kind of report back so everybody gets a glimpse of what you talked about in the rooms that maybe they didn't get to attend. So I'll just go through each of them. Maybe we'll start with Lindsay.
Thanks, Kyle. Wow, there's so much to reflect on. I apologize to everyone. I ran out of time in my breakout room, but maybe one theme that just seems to be coming across, I think today for me, is just navigating unequal power relations and in community-based research partnerships with academics and trying to really find deliberate ways to I guess to rectify those imbalances and address them directly from the get-go and have them in view throughout your relationship. And I think that really is fundamental to creating solid building blocks for a sustainable collaboration for years to come.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe next I'll flip to Tristan.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'll also apologize to my breakout group. We also ran out of time. Kelsey asked a good question as we were like on the verge of getting booted about measuring success in relation to getting grants, both research-focused grants and then also sort of operational grants too. And so I think one of the things that I took away from my little spiel in our breakout room and then the discussion that happened today is that a lot of our community partners might not really know where to start in terms of creating a research partnership, or are already feeling maybe a little bit stretched thin in terms of their capacity with trying to, sort of do their jobs, and then also recognizing the importance of, sort of doing research too. And so just what that looks like, and, trying to think as a researcher how you can sort of assist in sort of creating the space and the capacity for community organizations and partners to see some of that research through.
Awesome. And that was something we've certainly talked about as we came together with this event. You know, we hoped for a big turnout of community partners and to be a resource, and then we ended up with a lot of academics and students. So not a bad thing. It's still a resource, and you know, we recorded this, so it will be online. It will be available. So in the future, if anybody could ever use some of this stuff as a useful resource, it will be there for people. But that is certainly something that we've discussed a few times in the last few weeks as we were pulling this together. So thank you. Next, maybe I'll flip to Michael.
I'll try and just say it real quick. One of the great things that I heard brought up in ours was like how to decolonize the research process, so that the whole thing is a little bit different. And that we actually get to those points, especially when we start from the points of understanding like the truth behind some of our research processes have been very unethical. And then what we can do as stepping points forward, especially to be a little more relationally accountable and share who we are in each other's lives. So I think that's one of those big points.
Awesome, thank you. That would we need a whole other session to get into some of the really important conversations that we need to have around that. Thank you. And now I'll move to the last group here. Maybe I'll go Kylie.
Wonderful, thank you. And again, we also got cut off a common theme, but I would say that my question or a comment ties definitely into all the things echoed by the other wonderful panelists. From the community partners perspective, I'll speak perhaps. Someone asked, Kelsey had asked about, you know, that protection and that positionality from the community partners point of view, and that I would encourage, if we're using that dating analogy, that, you know, you start maybe with that sharing of a space, you start to share, you know, get to know each other, but then not giving access to your community or participants or individuals until you have that firm and secure articulation of that reciprocal relationship and what exactly you, the community partner, will obtain and get, what benefit you will get out of this. Because we have seen so many times of the exploitation of groups, particularly marginalized communities. So again, recognizing that positionality and then also empowering the community group. Maybe it's through, again, their own MOUs to tie to, you know, Lindsay, but to have those things up front to say, this is what we, you know, the conditions that we have of this relationship.
Cool, thank you. And Corliss.
Excellent. Yeah, I build off exactly what Kylie was talking about. I think one of my main take homes, relevant not just for evaluation, but research and common themes that we've heard throughout the day, is the importance of those initial conversations and taking time to have those conversations before diving into research or evaluation projects. So taking the time to, I think Marika mentioned, let's have 4 meetings before we even agree to work with a partner to make sure that we've carved out whose roles and responsibilities of the partnership, talking about like maybe the vision, the mission, potential values that each partner is going to bring to the table. I think one thing that we've done in the past that's been really successful is thinking about, okay, what are the goals of this research project or the expectations of this research project, but what are we also expected of this partnership? And that's where maybe you establish terms of reference that what is each party bringing to the table. And it's so it's time consuming and resource intensive, but it's very much worth investing the time in having those important conversations from the outset. And then that sets you kind of, as you continue to have ongoing open communication throughout that process, you still have that very strong foundation to build from.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for these conversations. This was, it's been great kind of bouncing in and hearing everyone talking. Thank you especially to all of our panelists for your discussion. I will open the floor here. If people have questions, you want to drop it in the chat or open up, you certainly can. But I do want to recognize we're getting close to time. So if people need to drop out or take off, I'm totally happy with that. I'm happy to stick around and chat with people. Before I kind of close it out officially though, I just want to flip it over to Lorena and Marika, if either of you have kind of closing comments or things you wanted to add as we kind of wrap things up here.
Sure. I just want to say that I think, again, what I think is interesting about this conversation is that it's in some ways it's a starting point, that there's still so many more conversations that we can have and learnings to go on, both from the practical side. A lot of this is practical. How do we do this? How do we navigate these things? But I think it's also deeper. It's the philosophical. It is some of these bigger questions, and we've got lots of experts that are around here that are still working through it, but it'd be nice to have more conversations about this so that people could engage in some of the, again, both how do we do it, but how do we also change things, push against things, talk about the relationships and talk about the philosophies. So I'm very energized by this. I wish I could keep going with this, but unfortunately I've got marking to do, so I'll get back to that.
Oh, great. I would just thank Kyle and Lorena for this initiative. It's such an important space, and that's what we keep hearing. I think we could have a full workshop on any, like, I'd love to spend 2 hours or 3 hours just discussing agreements, for example. So let's, apply for another grant, the bigger follow-up, and let's do this ×5, right? Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you again so much, everyone. If people do want to hang out, I'm happy to sit here and chat. I think one thing that we will do is follow up with a message to everyone and just share all those resources that we put in the chat. So to those panelists, if you could just send those to me and Tammy, we'll make sure they get in and out to everyone who registered. And for everyone, just watch your email, and we'll get you some of those resources there. So thank you everyone again so much. It was great hanging out with you today, and I hope to see you all in the future. Place to learn about, good question. Grants and available timelines. I think every grant would likely have a different timeline. I know that my tax one that I talked about before is open, I believe. There isn't a deadline on it. You can apply to my tax anytime. For the SSHRC ones that I've been a part of in the past, so Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, they have partnership engage grants, which are like small pots of money where you work with an organization. I believe they do those 4 times a year. So it's kind of a cycling one as well. I'm not sure about other ones. I don't know if Marika or Lorena, if you have examples.
Yeah, I was just typing in the chat. So I'd say, Canada Basketball has a new foundation that's granting out. MLC Foundation, of course, SSHRC, Sport Information Resource Center of Canada are also good places to look for industry grants that are a bit smaller scale, a bit more bite-sized.
Yeah, SSHRC has a great email. They send out one email every day with all kinds of information in it, and that is a real go-to spot for me for info on sports specific stuff. It comes out. Oh, Trillium grants there.
Kyle?
Yep.
How do you spell this SSHRC?
SSIRC, SIRC. It's the Sport Information Resource Center. And it's an MSO, so multi-sport, I think it's one of the multi-sport organizations that's kind of under the umbrella of Sport Canada. And their role is, thank you for sharing that, Corliss, is to connect, it's the sport information. So it's like the sport library, really. They do a lot of knowledge mobilization work, bringing researchers to practitioners. They have a conference in the fall, lots of cool and interesting stuff. Oh yeah, E-Alliance, that's a research hub as well. Yeah, so there's lots of these kind of networks or groups out there that are really good resources to be a part of.
Thank you so much.
No worries. Tammy, copy and paste all these. We'll include them in our in our list of resources. If people have others, throw them in there. We'll make sure we capture this and share it out with everyone.